He said marrying my daughter was the biggest mistake of his life. He said it just minutes before he vowed to love her forever. I was the only one who heard it. And in that moment, I didn't just want to stop the wedding. I wanted to prove to him and to my daughter that she was the greatest blessing he would ever have and lose. My name is Margaret Walsh. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 43 years as a school principal in Portland, Oregon. I thought I knew how to spot a liar, a manipulator, someone who would hurt the children in my care. I was wrong. Because the most dangerous predator I ever encountered didn't come from my students, he came from my daughter. Sarah is my only child, my miracle baby, born when the doctors said it was impossible. 28 years old, a pediatric nurse at Portland Children's Hospital, with a heart so pure she sees angels where the rest of us see strangers. Her father used to say she was born without the gene for suspicion. She trusted everyone, believed the best in people, gave second chances to those who'd already proven they didn't deserve first ones. When David died 5 years ago, my husband, Sarah's father, I became her only protection against a world that would gladly devour someone so genuinely good. I watched her like a hawk. Maybe too closely, certainly too obviously. Sarah accused me of being overprotective, of trying to control her life, of being unable to let her grow up. She was right, and she was wrong. Right that I was protecting her, wrong about why. Because stories like ours matter. They matter because predators count on our silence, on our shame, on our willingness to suffer in private rather than expose the ugly truth. They matter because somewhere, right now, another mother is watching her daughter fall for a beautiful lie, and she needs to know she's not crazy for feeling afraid. If you believe in the power of a mother's love to see through deception, if you know that sometimes the people who claim to love us are really our greatest enemies, then you need to hear what happened when I discovered that my daughter's fairy tale wedding was actually a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Subscribe to hear more stories like this one, because the only thing more dangerous than a predator is a community that refuses to speak their names out loud. Because what I discovered about James Morrison didn't just break my heart. It nearly destroyed my family. And by the time I understood the full scope of his deception, my daughter was already walking down the aisle toward a man who'd spent months planning her destruction. April 15th, 2023, the most beautiful spring day Portland had seen in years, as if the universe itself was conspiring to make Sarah's wedding perfect. St. Mary's Cathedral stood like a Gothic fairy tale against the clear blue sky, its bells already ringing in celebration of what everyone believed would be the happiest day of my daughter's life. 200 guests filled those ancient pews, Sarah's colleagues from the pediatric ward, our extended family, friends who'd watched her grow from a little girl who bandaged injured birds to a woman who dedicated her life to healing children. The cathedral was decorated with white peonies and baby's breath, the same flowers David had chosen for our wedding 32 years earlier. And Sarah, gosh, she was radiant. She wore my mother's wedding dress, ivory silk with Belgian lace that had been carefully preserved for 60 years, waiting for this moment. When I helped her into it that morning, watching her transform into a bride, I felt that bittersweet ache every mother knows. My little girl was leaving me, starting her own family with a man who'd swept her off her feet. James Morrison. 32 years old, 6 feet tall, with the kind of easy smile that made everyone like him instantly. He claimed to be a real estate developer who'd built his company from nothing, the American dream personified. He drove a BMW, wore expensive suits, and had a confidence that drew people to him like moths to flame. He'd met Sarah at a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital 6 months earlier. She told me later that he'd approached her at the silent auction, commenting on her bid for a weekend at a coastal resort. "You have excellent taste," he'd said, "but I think you're undervaluing what you deserve." Within an hour, he'd convinced her to let him take her to dinner instead of bidding on a vacation. 6 months. That's all it took for him to propose, plan a wedding, and integrate himself so completely into our family that questioning his motives seemed petty and suspicious. Sarah was glowing with happiness, talking about their plans to expand his business, maybe start a family within a year or two. But something felt off. Small things at first. The way he deflected questions about his work, always speaking in generalities about development projects and investor meetings. How he'd grown uncomfortable when I'd suggested meeting his family, claiming they lived overseas and couldn't travel. The fact that in 6 months of dating my daughter, I'd never met a single friend or colleague of his. David used to say I had radar for dishonesty, honed by decades of catching students in lies. But every time I voiced these concerns, Sarah accused me of being unable to let her be happy, of trying to sabotage her relationship because I couldn't accept that she'd found love. The morning of the wedding, I pushed those doubts aside. This was Sarah's day, and my job was to support her happiness, not project my own fears onto her future. I arrived at the cathedral 2 hours early, helping coordinate the flowers, greeting guests, playing the role of the gracious mother of the bride. James looked perfect in his black tuxedo, greeting everyone with that charming smile and firm handshake. He thanked me for raising such an incredible woman and promised to love Sarah exactly as she deserves to be loved. The words should have reassured me. Instead, they felt rehearsed, like lines from a script he'd memorized. 30 minutes before the ceremony, I decided to offer him the traditional mother-in-law blessing, something my own mother-in-law had done for David, a moment of private connection before the public celebration. I walked to the groom's preparation room in the cathedral's east wing, my heart full of hope that maybe, finally, I could put my doubts to rest. The door was slightly ajar. Voices carried from within. James and his best man Marcus, whom Sarah had introduced as his business partner. I raised my hand to knock, but James's tone stopped me cold. It wasn't the voice of a nervous but happy groom. It was frustrated, angry, desperate. "I can't believe I'm going through with this," he said. "This whole thing is a massive mistake." Marcus replied, "Dude, you're just nervous. Sarah's amazing." "He's sweet, sure," James continued, "but she's not the one. God help me, I should have listened to my gut and ended this months ago. But I'm in too deep now." "But the business opportunity," Marcus said. "The medical supply contracts through her hospital connections." I know. James's voice carried the weight of a man trapped by his own greed. The pediatric ward connections alone could be worth millions to Morrison Development. I'm basically trading my freedom for financial security. Her mother's investment firm, the hospital contracts, even the family name. It's all part of the package. What a goddamn mess. I stood there in that hallway, my hand still raised to knock, and felt my world collapse. This wasn't pre-wedding jitters. This wasn't a man nervous about commitment. This was a calculated predator discussing my daughter like a business acquisition, measuring her worth in contracts and connections while preparing to vow eternal love. In that moment, I understood that Sarah wasn't getting married. She was being purchased, and I was the only person in that entire cathedral who knew the truth. 28 minutes until my daughter walked down the aisle to marry a man who'd just called her the biggest mistake of his life. 28 minutes to save my daughter from the biggest mistake of her life. I ran through the cathedral corridors like a woman possessed, my heels echoing against the stone floors as I rushed toward the bridal suite. My mind raced through a dozen different ways to explain what I'd heard, but how do you shatter someone's fairy tale without sounding like the villain in their story? I found Sarah standing before the antique mirror in the cathedral's bridal preparation room, radiant in her great-grandmother's lace. She was adjusting her veil with the careful precision of someone who wanted every detail to be perfect. When she saw me burst through the door, her face lit up with pure joy. "Mom, isn't this the most beautiful day? I feel like I'm living in a dream." "Sarah, sweetheart, I need to talk to you about something urgent. About James." The happiness in her eyes flickered, replaced by concern. "What's wrong? Is he okay? Did something happen?" I closed the door behind me, my hands shaking as I tried to find words that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a jealous mother. I just overheard James talking to Marcus. What I heard, it changes everything. Sarah, he called marrying you a mistake. He said he should have ended your relationship months ago. He said this whole wedding is about business connections, the hospital contracts, my investment firm. He's not marrying you for love, sweetheart. He's marrying you for what our family can give him. I watched my daughter's face transform from confusion to horror, but not the kind of horror I'd expected. She wasn't shocked by James's betrayal. She was horrified at me. "Mother, that's impossible," she said, her voice steady but her eyes flashing with hurt. "James loves me. Everyone gets nervous before their wedding. You're reading malice into normal pre-ceremony jitters." "Sarah, listen to me." "No, you listen to me." Her voice rose, and I saw steel in her expression I'd never seen before. "Do you hear yourself? You're accusing my fiancé of being some kind of con artist based on eavesdropping outside his door 20 minutes before our wedding." "But sweetheart, he specifically mentioned the medical supply contracts, the business opportunities through your hospital connections. Things you couldn't have told him because you don't even know those details yourself." Sarah stared at me for a long moment, and I watched our relationship fracture in real time. "You know what I think? I think you can't stand that I found happiness without your approval. I think you're so used to controlling every aspect of my life that you can't accept I'm capable of choosing my own husband." She stepped closer, her wedding dress rustling with the movement, and I saw my little girl transform into a woman defending her territory. "Ever since Dad died, you've been suffocating me. Every man I've dated has been wrong in your eyes. Too young, too old, too ambitious, not ambitious enough. And now, on the happiest day of my life, you're trying to destroy my marriage with paranoid conspiracy theories." "Sarah, I'm begging you, just postpone the ceremony. Give me 24 hours to prove what I'm telling you." "Postpone?" Sarah's voice reached a pitch I'd never heard before. "Postpone my wedding? 200 guests, the cathedral booking, the reception, the honeymoon reservations. You want me to destroy all of that because you think you overheard something that confirms your worst assumptions about James?" The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, I realized James had prepared her for this exact conversation. He'd spent months planting seeds of doubt about my motives, framing my protective instincts as controlling behavior. "Mom, I love you," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying the terrible finality of a door slamming shut. "But if you can't support my marriage, maybe you shouldn't be part of it. James warned me this might happen. He said sometimes families struggle to accept when their children find genuine happiness." The manipulation was so perfect, so complete, that I felt dizzy with admiration for James's skill, even as it destroyed my relationship with my daughter. He'd inoculated her against my warnings, made my love look like jealousy, my protection seem like sabotage. "I need you to leave," Sarah continued, her voice steady with resolve. "I need to finish getting ready. If you can find a way to be happy for me, you're welcome at the ceremony. If not—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the ultimatum was clear: smile and play along with my daughter's destruction, or be excluded from the most important day of her life. 18 minutes later, I sat in the front pew of St. Mary's Cathedral watching my daughter float down the aisle like a vision from heaven. The string quartet played Canon in D while 200 guests rose to their feet, but all I could see was the predator waiting at the altar, resplendent in his tuxedo and practiced smile. James's performance was flawless. When Sarah reached him, he took her hands with such tender reverence that several guests dabbed their eyes. His vows spoke of destiny, of finding his soulmate, of building a future worthy of the love they shared. Every word was perfectly chosen, every gesture calculated to reinforce the image of a man overwhelmed by his good fortune. Sarah's vows were devastating in their sincerity. She promised to love, honor, and cherish this man with her whole heart. When she spoke about trust, about finding someone who loved her for herself rather than what she could provide, I had to grip the pew to keep from screaming. "You may kiss the bride," the minister announced, and the cathedral erupted in applause as Mr. and Mrs. James Morrison sealed their union beneath the Gothic arches and stained-glass saints. I applauded with the rest, my face arranged in an expression of maternal joy that felt like wearing broken glass. But inside, I was already planning. If Sarah wouldn't listen to warnings, she'd have to be convinced by evidence. If she wouldn't accept my word, she'd have to see the truth with her own eyes. James Morrison had just made the greatest mistake of his predatory career. He'd underestimated a mother's love and a school principal's determination to protect her child. The wedding reception would last until midnight. I had 8 hours to begin building the case that would save my daughter's life and destroy the man who thought he could steal it. The reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and champagne toasts while my mind dissected every detail of James's deception. As Portland's finest celebrated what they believed was a perfect union, I cataloged every inconsistency I'd previously dismissed as quirks or nervousness. The way he deflected specific questions about his projects, his vague responses about clients and contracts, the fact that in 6 months, not a single colleague or friend had attended any family function. Sleep was impossible that night. I paced the floors of my empty house until dawn, replaying James's words and Sarah's devastating rejection. By sunrise, I'd made a decision that would have shocked the proper school principal I'd been for 4 decades. I was going to investigate my son-in-law like the criminal I suspected he was. My first call was to Frank Garrett, my late husband's business partner and oldest friend. At 71, Frank had handled our family's financial affairs for 30 years and possessed the kind of street-smart wisdom that made him invaluable in Portland's business community. "Margaret," his gravelly voice carried concern when he answered at 7 a.m. "I assume this isn't a social call given the hour and the fact that Sarah's wedding was yesterday?" I told him everything. James's overheard conversation, Sarah's refusal to listen, my growing certainty that my new son-in-law posed a threat to more than just my daughter's happiness. Frank listened without interruption, his business mind processing implications. I was only beginning to understand. "Margaret, you mentioned he specifically talked about medical supply contracts through Sarah's hospital connections. What exactly did you mean by that business merger he discussed?" "What business merger, Frank?" "Sarah works as a pediatric nurse. She doesn't have access to supply contracts." The silence that followed told me Frank was putting pieces together that I hadn't even known existed. "Margaret, I need to show you something. Can you meet me at the office in an hour?" Frank's downtown Portland office occupied 2 floors of a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and industrial charm that reflected his no-nonsense approach to business. When I arrived, he had files spread across his mahogany conference table, documents that would change everything I thought I knew about James Morrison. "3 weeks ago," Frank began, his voice grim, "James approached me about a business partnership. He claimed Sarah had mentioned that Walsh Family Investments was looking to diversify into healthcare-related ventures. Frank, I never told Sarah anything about healthcare investments. We've never even discussed that sector." "I know, which is why I did some preliminary research on Morrison Development before our meeting. Margaret, his company was on the verge of bankruptcy. He owes creditors over $300,000. The successful real estate development business exists mostly on paper." Frank pulled out financial statements that painted a devastating picture. Morrison Development operated out of a shared workspace downtown, the kind that charged monthly fees for mail forwarding and conference room access. The company had been incorporated only 8 months earlier, 2 months before James met Sarah, despite his claims of building it over 5 years. "But here's what really concerned me," Frank continued, sliding another document across the table. He knew specific details about Portland Children's Hospital's medical supply procurement process, information that someone would only have access to if they were working with insider knowledge. The picture Frank painted was of a man who'd researched our family with surgical precision. He'd identified Sarah as a target not because he'd fallen in love with her at a charity event, but because he'd studied her, learned her routines, and positioned himself to accidentally meet her at exactly the right moment. "Frank, I need to know everything about James Morrison. Everything he's told us? Everything he's hidden? Everything he's planning? What's the best way to get that information? Private investigator, Frank said without hesitation. Rebecca Chen, former FBI white-collar crime specialist. She's handled sensitive matters for half the families in Portland, including exposing a romance scam that cost the Hartwell family $2 million last year. 2 hours later, I sat across from Rebecca Chen in her downtown office, a converted Victorian that whispered of discretion and deadly competence. Rebecca herself was surprisingly understated, mid-40s, sharp brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of unremarkable appearance that probably served her well in investigations. Mrs. Walsh, Rebecca began, her voice carrying just a trace of her Oregon roots. Frank Garrett's referral means a great deal to me. He's outlined your concerns about your son-in-law. Before we proceed, I need you to understand what you're asking for. I'm asking you to investigate whether James Morrison is who he claims to be. No, ma'am. You're asking me to potentially destroy your daughter's marriage and possibly her trust in you forever. If I find evidence that James is legitimate, that his story is true, will you be able to accept that your suspicions were wrong? The question hit harder than I'd expected, but I knew my answer. Ms. Chen, I heard him with my own ears describe my daughter as a mistake and outline plans to exploit our family's business connections. Even if everything else about him is legitimate, that conversation alone proves he married Sarah under false pretenses. Rebecca leaned back in her leather chair, studying me with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading human nature. I'll need a retainer of $15,000 and complete access to any financial records you're willing to share. I'll also need you to understand that once I start pulling threads, there's no controlling where they lead. I wrote the check without hesitation. Rebecca's first report arrived 48 hours later, delivered by encrypted email to an account I'd created specifically for our correspondence. What I read made my blood run cold, and my worst fears seem optimistic by comparison. Morrison Development wasn't just struggling, it was a complete fabrication. The downtown Portland address James had given Sarah was actually that shared workspace Frank had mentioned. The company had been incorporated only 8 months earlier, with James as the sole employee and officer. His claimed portfolio of successful projects existed only in marketing materials he'd apparently created himself. More disturbing was the personal picture Rebecca painted. James's penthouse apartment wasn't owned but rented month to month, under a lease that required no credit check. The BMW he drove was leased under terms that suggested someone with damaged credit and limited income. His entire lifestyle was being funded by sources that had nothing to do with real estate development. Subject is living approximately $200,000 above any legitimate income I can identify, Rebecca's report stated. Personal debt load includes maxed credit cards, personal loans, and what appears to be funding from an unidentified private source. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. Rebecca had begun mapping James's movements and activities for the 6 months before he'd met Sarah. The pattern that emerged wasn't random. It was methodical, calculated, predatory. He'd attended charity events at 3 different hospitals before focusing on Portland Children's. He'd researched the staff, learned their schedules, identified the most valuable targets. Sarah hadn't been a lucky accident. She'd been selected, studied, and hunted with the precision of a professional predator. My daughter hadn't fallen in love, she'd been captured by someone who'd spent months learning exactly how to become irresistible to her. And I was the only person who knew the truth. Rebecca's investigation moved with the precision of a surgeon cutting through layers of deception. Each report that arrived in my encrypted inbox revealed new depths to James's carefully constructed lies. But it was her third communication that changed everything from suspicion to criminal certainty. Mrs. Walsh, Rebecca's voice was tense when she called me directly for the first time. I need to see you immediately. What I've discovered goes far beyond simple financial fraud. Your son-in-law isn't just a con artist. He's a serial predator with a documented pattern spanning at least 3 years. We met at a coffee shop in Northeast Portland, far from the downtown corridors where James conducted his fake business. Rebecca arrived with a thick manila folder and the grim expression of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's darker nature. "I've identified 3 previous relationships that follow an identical pattern to his pursuit of Sarah," she began, sliding photographs across the small table. Each woman from a wealthy Portland family, each relationship lasting between 4 and 8 months, each ending with the woman financially or emotionally devastated. The first photograph showed a beautiful blonde woman in her early 30s standing beside James at what appeared to be a charity gala. Amanda Torres, pharmaceutical heiress. Her family owns a chain of medical clinics throughout Oregon. James dated her for 6 months 2 years ago, convinced her to invest $200,000 in Morrison Development, then disappeared 3 days after the check cleared. Amanda went to the police, but James had been careful to structure everything as legitimate investment documents. Legally, she'd simply made a bad business decision. Morally and emotionally, she'd been systematically destroyed by someone she'd trusted with her heart. The second photograph was even more disturbing. A young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, remarkably similar to Sarah in both appearance and apparent temperament. Jennifer Hartwell, judge's daughter, works as a social worker. James dated her for 4 months, used her family connections to get criminal charges dropped against one of his business associates, then claimed work obligations required him to relocate to Seattle. But it was the third photograph that made my blood run cold. Another young woman, this one a dead ringer for Sarah. Same build, same coloring, same gentle expression that spoke of someone who saw good in everyone. Patricia Ming, only daughter of the family that owns Ming Electronics. 8-month relationship, engagement ring, wedding plans. James convinced her to sign documents that gave him access to her trust fund, then claimed he'd discovered she was cheating and broke off the engagement. She's been in therapy for 2 years. Rebecca, these women, they all look like Sarah. They all work in caring professions, all come from prominent families with business connections James could exploit. Mrs. Walsh, your daughter wasn't chosen randomly. She was selected from a very specific type, and James spent months studying how to become exactly what she needed him to be. He's not just a con artist, he's a psychological predator who specializes in destroying good women from influential families. But Rebecca had saved the most damning evidence for last. From her folder, she produced printed copies of text message conversations that would haunt my nightmares for months to come. I managed to locate Amanda Torres. She's been waiting 2 years for someone to believe her story about James. She not only agreed to cooperate, she provided recordings and documents that prove James's entire operation is premeditated. The text messages painted a picture of calculated cruelty that staggered me. James had maintained contact with Amanda throughout his relationship with Sarah, describing his new target in terms that reduced my daughter to a business acquisition. "The nurse is perfect," one message read. "Sweet enough to trust completely, connected enough to be valuable, naive enough to never suspect." Her family's investment firm alone could be worth millions, plus the hospital contracts through her pediatric connections. Another message, sent just 3 weeks before his wedding to Sarah. "I should feel guilty about this, but honestly, she makes it so easy. She actually thinks I fell in love with her at first sight. The trust fund access after marriage will solve all my debt problems." But the most devastating message had been sent to Amanda just 2 days after the wedding. "The deed is done. Mrs. Morrison is busy planning our future while I'm planning my exit strategy. 6 months to liquidate what I can, then another convenient business opportunity will require relocation. She'll never see it coming." Rebecca had also discovered financial evidence that proved James was already implementing his theft. 3 unauthorized transfers had been made from the Walsh family investments account that Frank had established for the supposed merger. $50,000 had disappeared into a private account controlled solely by James. "Mrs. Walsh, this constitutes embezzlement. We have enough evidence right now to have James arrested and charged with multiple felonies." "No, not yet. If we move too quickly, Sarah will never believe us. She'll think we manufactured evidence to break up her marriage. James has spent months conditioning her to distrust my motives. We need something so overwhelming, so undeniable, that even she can't rationalize it away. Rebecca nodded, understanding the delicate psychology at play. What did you have in mind? We let him dig his own grave deeper. We document every theft, every lie, every moment of his true character. And we get it all on record so when the time comes to confront him, Sarah will hear the truth in his own words. Over the following 3 weeks, Rebecca and I became partners in the most important investigation of my life. We installed surveillance equipment in my home office, where James had taken to conducting his fake business calls. We documented every unauthorized transaction. We recorded his phone conversations with Amanda, where he continued to mock Sarah's naivety and plan his eventual abandonment. Frank, meanwhile, worked to protect our family's assets while giving James enough rope to hang himself. We allowed him to make one more significant transfer, $75,000, while ensuring the transaction was fully documented and traceable. Mrs. Walsh, Rebecca said during our final planning meeting, we now have evidence of embezzlement, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. But more importantly, we have recordings of James discussing his plans to abandon Sarah after he's stolen everything he can from your family. Then it's time to end this nightmare. The family meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon in mid-May, ostensibly to discuss expansion plans for the medical supply venture James believed he was stealing. Sarah would be there, expecting to hear about her husband's growing success. Instead, she would finally learn the truth about the man she'd married. James Morrison's 5 months as a member of our family were about to come to an explosive end. Sunday, May 21, 2023. The morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical Portland spring weather that seemed to mirror the storm about to break over our family. I'd chosen the formal dining room for our meeting, the same room where David and I had hosted countless business dinners, where Sarah had done her homework as a child, where 3 generations of Walsh family decisions had been made around the mahogany table that had belonged to my grandmother. Frank arrived first, carrying a leather briefcase that contained financial documents and Rebecca's investigation files. Rebecca herself waited in my study, monitoring recording equipment that would capture every word of what was about to unfold. We'd agreed that James needed to incriminate himself in his own voice, with Sarah present to witness his complete destruction. Sarah and James arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, my daughter radiant in a yellow sundress that made her look impossibly young and trusting. She'd been married exactly 5 weeks, and the honeymoon glow still surrounded her like armor against the ugly truth we were about to reveal. James wore his confidence like expensive cologne, a crisp white shirt, navy blazer, and that practiced smile that had fooled my daughter and half of Portland's social elite. He carried a portfolio of fake business documents, prepared to discuss expansion plans for medical supply contracts he believed he was successfully stealing. "Mom, this is so exciting," Sarah said, kissing my cheek as they settled into chairs around the table. "James has been working on some incredible opportunities with the hospital systems. I can't wait to hear how our families can work together." "Yes, sweetheart, I think you're going to be very surprised by what we've discovered about James's business operations." James's smile never wavered, but I caught the slightest tightening around his eyes. After 5 weeks of marriage, he'd grown comfortable, confident that his deception was complete and undetectable. Frank had played his role perfectly, maintaining the facade of enthusiastic business partnership while documenting every fraudulent transaction. "Frank, why don't you start by reviewing our current business arrangements with Morrison Development?" I said, my voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in education and a lifetime of protecting people I loved. Frank opened his briefcase with theatrical precision, removing financial statements that painted a very different picture than the success story James had been spinning. "Of course, Margaret. I think James will be particularly interested in seeing how his company's financial profile has developed over the past 5 weeks." The first document Frank placed on the table was Morrison Development's actual financial statement, the real one, not the fabricated version James had been showing Sarah. The numbers were devastating. Negative cash flow, massive personal debt, and no legitimate income sources. "James," Frank said conversationally, I'm curious about these discrepancies between your reported assets and your actual financial position. For instance, you've claimed Morrison Development has completed 12 major projects in the past 2 years, but I can't find permits, contracts, or payments for any of them. James's confident demeanor began to crack around the edges. I'm not sure what you mean, Frank. All our documentation is in order. Actually, it's not. I reached into my own folder and produced the surveillance photographs Rebecca had taken of James's actual office, the shared workspace downtown where he paid monthly fees for mail forwarding. This is where Morrison Development is actually located, a WeWork space that charges $300 a month for a mailing address. I don't understand, Sarah said, looking between James and me with dawning confusion. James, you showed me your office. The building downtown with your name on the directory? Sweetheart, that was a conference room I rented for the day, I said gently, the same way he rented that BMW and the furniture in his apartment. James's entire lifestyle has been funded by money he's stolen from our family and others. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched James's face cycle through surprise, calculation, and finally, cold fury as he realized the trap that had been carefully constructed around him. "This is insane," he said, his voice losing its practiced charm for the first time since I'd known him. "Margaret, I don't know what kind of paranoid conspiracy theory you've constructed, but—" "Let me play something for you," I interrupted, reaching for the small recording device Rebecca had given me. "This is a conversation you had with Amanda Torres 3 days ago." James's own voice filled the dining room, casual and cruel as he described his plans for Sarah's destruction. "The little nurse is so trusting it's almost boring. She actually believes I fell in love with her at first sight. I should feel guilty about taking her for everything she's worth, but honestly, she makes it so easy." Sarah's gasp was audible across the table. Her face went white, then red, then white again as she processed the evidence of her husband's betrayal. But James wasn't finished burying himself. The recording continued. "6 more months and I'll have liquidated everything worth taking. Then another convenient business opportunity will require relocation, and Mrs. Morrison will be left wondering what happened to her fairy tale marriage." "That's not possible," Sarah whispered, staring at James as if seeing him for the first time. You couldn't have..." But James had moved beyond denial into open hostility. The mask he'd worn for 8 months finally slipped completely, revealing the predator underneath. "You know what, Margaret? You're absolutely right," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I never loved your precious daughter. She was a means to an end, a pathetic little nurse with family connections worth exploiting. The hardest part wasn't lying to her. It was pretending her boring conversation and needy personality were endearing instead of suffocating." "James, stop. Please stop." "Why should I stop now?" James continued, his cruelty unleashed. "You want to know the truth, Sarah? You were the easiest mark I've ever targeted. So desperate to be loved, so eager to believe in fairy tales. I could have convinced you to marry me after 3 months instead of 6, if I'd wanted to rush the timeline." Frank and I exchanged glances. This was going even better than we'd hoped. James was destroying himself with his own words, eliminating any possibility that Sarah would defend him or rationalize his behavior. "That's enough," I said, standing from my chair with the authority that had commanded respect in countless school board meetings and parent conferences. "James Morrison, you have embezzled $125,000 from Walsh Family Investments. You have defrauded my daughter through a fraudulent marriage based on identity theft and false pretenses. You have systematically destroyed at least 3 other women before targeting Sarah." I placed Rebecca's complete investigation file on the table. Photographs, financial records, recorded conversations, testimony from his previous victims. "You have exactly one choice," I continued, my voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You can sign annulment papers, forfeit any claim to our family's assets, and disappear from Portland forever. Or I will have you arrested for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy, and your trial will be front-page news in every newspaper from here to Seattle." James looked at the evidence, at Frank's implacable expression, at Sarah's tear-streaked face, and finally at me. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw something real in his eyes, the cornered desperation of a predator who'd finally been caught. "Fine," he said, his voice flat with defeat. "I'll sign your papers. But don't think this makes you the hero of some story, Margaret. Sarah's going to spend the rest of her life wondering if every man who shows interest in her is another version of me. I may have lost, but I've damaged her in ways you'll never be able to fix." "Get out of my house," I said. "Sign the papers Frank prepared. Take nothing that belongs to my family and never contact my daughter again. If I see you anywhere near Sarah, or discover you've targeted another woman, I will personally ensure that your next victims know exactly what kind of monster you are." James signed the annulment papers without reading them, his movements sharp with barely contained rage. As he gathered his fake portfolio and prepared to leave, he looked at Sarah one final time. "Goodbye, sweetheart," he said, his voice mocking the endearment he'd whispered during their brief marriage. "I hope you find someone worthy of your special kind of innocence." The door closed behind James Morrison with a finality that seemed to echo through the house. Sarah sat at the dining room table, surrounded by the evidence of her shattered marriage, and for the first time in 5 weeks, I saw my real daughter instead of the love-struck bride who'd been living in a beautiful lie. "Mom," she whispered, her voice broken but somehow stronger than it had been in months. "I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you." "No, sweetheart," I said, moving to wrap my arms around my daughter. "You should have been able to trust the man you married. The fact that you couldn't isn't a failure of your judgment. It's proof of his skill as a predator." James Morrison had finally made his first honest statement. He had damaged Sarah in ways that would take time to heal. But he'd underestimated the strength of a woman who dedicated her life to healing others, and the power of a mother's love to help her daughter rebuild from even the most devastating betrayal. The silence that followed James's departure was profound, not empty, but full of possibility. For the first time in 8 months, my daughter was free from the web of manipulation that had redefined her reality. Sarah sat at our family's dining room table, surrounded by evidence of the most sophisticated deception either of us had ever encountered, and slowly began the process of reclaiming herself. The immediate aftermath was brutal. Sarah spent 3 days in her childhood bedroom, emerging only for meals and long walks through the neighborhood where she'd grown up. I watched her process the scope of James's betrayal, not just the financial theft or the fake identity, but the psychological violation of having her deepest emotions weaponized against her. "Mom," she said on the 4th day, finding me in the garden where I'd been tending the roses David had planted 20 years earlier. "I keep thinking about all the moments I thought were real. Our first conversation, the way he seemed to understand me so perfectly, how he always knew exactly what to say to make me feel special. Sweetheart, those feelings were real even if his weren't. Your capacity for love, for trust, for seeing the best in people. James didn't create those qualities, and he couldn't destroy them. He simply exploited them for a while. But Sarah's healing process revealed a strength I'd always known she possessed, but had never seen fully unleashed. Within a week, she'd contacted Amanda Torres, Jennifer Hartwell, and Patricia Ming, James's previous victims, and begun organizing a support network for women who'd been targeted by romantic predators. "These women have been carrying shame and self-doubt for years," Sarah told me, her voice carrying a new authority born from her own experience. "They think they were stupid for falling for his lies, but they weren't stupid. They were deliberately targeted by someone who'd perfected the art of psychological manipulation." 6 weeks after the confrontation, Sarah returned to work at Portland Children's Hospital with a perspective that transformed her nursing practice. She'd always been compassionate, but now she possessed the hard-won wisdom to recognize manipulation and advocate more effectively for vulnerable patients and families. The financial recovery was swift. Frank and our legal team had structured everything to protect our assets while allowing James enough rope to hang himself. The $125,000 he'd stolen was recovered within 30 days, and Morrison Development was dissolved as the fraudulent entity it had always been. But the personal recovery was more complex and ultimately more valuable. Sarah began therapy with Dr. Helen Morrison, no relation to James, thankfully, a specialist in psychological trauma who helped her understand that intelligence and kindness aren't weaknesses, even when they're exploited by predators. I learned something important too, I told Dr. Morrison during one of the family sessions Sarah had requested. My protective instincts were right, but my methods were wrong. I should have taught Sarah how to recognize manipulation instead of trying to shield her from it entirely. The anniversary of Sarah's wedding, what we now call Freedom Day, passed quietly this year. Sarah spent it volunteering at a women's shelter, sharing her story with other survivors of psychological abuse. She's become an advocate for financial literacy education and has helped 3 other women escape similar situations before permanent damage was done. Rebecca Chen's investigation ultimately led to criminal charges against James in 2 other jurisdictions. Amanda Torres's testimony, combined with evidence from our case, convinced prosecutors in Seattle and Sacramento to pursue fraud charges for similar schemes James had operated before targeting Portland. He's currently serving an 18-month sentence and faces additional civil penalties that will prevent him from rebuilding his predatory operation. But this story isn't really about James Morrison's punishment. It's about the power of truth to triumph over even the most sophisticated deception, and the strength that emerges when good people refuse to accept injustice. Sarah is 31 now, 3 years older and immeasurably wiser than the trusting young woman who walked down the aisle of St. Mary's Cathedral. She's dating someone new, Dr. Michael Chen, Rebecca's younger brother and a pediatric oncologist at Sarah's hospital. Their relationship is built on complete honesty, shared values, and the kind of genuine compatibility that James spent months mimicking but could never authentically provide. The difference is unmistakable. With Michael, Sarah is herself. No performance, no attempt to be perfect, no fear that showing her true personality will drive him away. He loves her morning grumpiness, her tendency to cry at children's movies, her fierce protection of her patients, and yes, even her complicated relationship with an overprotective mother who turned out to be right about the monster in Prince's clothing. He thought my daughter was a mistake, but he was wrong about everything. Most especially that. Sarah wasn't a mistake, she was a test of his character, which he failed spectacularly. Her love was a gift he was too small and too broken to hold, let alone deserve. The real mistake was mine, not in protecting Sarah, but in believing that protection meant shielding her from the truth. The strongest protection I could have given her was the knowledge and tools to protect herself. Now she has both, along with the confidence that comes from surviving something that should have destroyed her and emerging stronger, wiser, and more authentically herself than ever before. If you're watching this and something about your own relationship feels familiar, if someone in your life discourages you from maintaining close family ties, if they seem too perfect or too interested in your family's financial situation, if they make you feel like you need to earn their love, trust that instinct. The people who truly love us don't require us to prove our worth or isolate us from other sources of support. Have you ever been made to feel less than you are by someone who claimed to love you? Have you survived a relationship where kindness was mistaken for weakness or where your best qualities were used against you? Share your story of finding your strength in the comments below. Subscribe for more stories about the power of truth over deception, the triumph of authentic love over manipulation, and the unbreakable bond between mothers and daughters who refuse to let predators win. Because every story we share makes it harder for the next James Morrison to succeed, and easier for the next Sarah to recognize danger before it destroys her life. The wilted wedding bouquet still sits on my vanity upstairs, not as a symbol of failure, but as a reminder that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Sarah's marriage to James Morrison lasted exactly 37 days. Her freedom from his deception will last the rest of her life. And sometimes that makes all the difference in the world. Trust the people who love you enough to tell you difficult truths. They might just save your life.